Hello, welcome to Sunday Night Foodball. My name is Alex Becker. This will be the smoker that I'll be using today. Pretty simple model, just an offset vertical smoker. Got my firebox over here. Meat will go in over here. And I've got some charcoals warming up here and in the chimney both. Throw those on together. I've got my lovely wife Evelise doing the recordings. She'll be doing the photo, videos, editing, all that good stuff. Appreciate her help. And what we're doing today is going to be based on the Sunday Night Football game. We got the Los Angeles Rams against the Chicago Bears. For Chicago, I'm going to be doing a Chicago dog. So that'd be an all-beef hot dog packed with all sorts of good things on top of it, like they do in Chicago. And for the Rams, I'm going to cheat just a little bit. I'm going to pretend that they're still in St. Louis, simply because I've been craving some St. Louis cut ribs anyways, and because we got two teams in Los Angeles, and I think both of them are going to be getting quite a few primetime games this year. Alright, first thing that we're going to be cooking is a slab of spare ribs. I'm going to do these St. Louis style. To do St. Louis style with spare ribs, you have to do a little bit of trimming first, unless you buy them St. Louis style ahead of time, which costs a little bit extra usually. So there's this flap over here that doesn't have much of the bones. It's mostly just loose meat and a little bit of fat. We're going to cut that part off, square up any extra little bits of fat, and we're going to cut off this cartilage section up here. That's going to make it really hard to chew if we don't do otherwise. So I'm going to start with this flap over here. Kind of want to just find the last bone that's fully connected and go after that one before the next one. Just going to run this way. That extra meat there, don't want to throw that away. I'm going to save that and use it with the beans. It gives it a lot of extra flavor. Now, got to take care of the cartilage section up here. That's going to be this section. Just find the seam with your fingers and cut right through there. I didn't quite get it there. Let's see. Might have overshot it just a bit. See if we can't find a seam still. There we go. Since this section, the bone runs crosswise to the rest of the ribs, that's going to make it a lot less pleasant when you're actually trying to chew them. I'm also going to trim up this little flap here. If I weren't doing beans, I would leave this on. It's not going to hurt anything if it's still attached to the ribs, but it'll do more good in the beans than it will here, since it does have a little bit less smooth of a shape. And now I'm just going to finish off, even though this part up here isn't cartilage, it's not attached to the rib bones either, it's another flap. And so just to get a nice square rack of ribs, I'm going to cut those even with where the cartilage left off up there. Might be easier if I turn that this way. Like I said, all this extra meat here is not going to go to waste. It's all going to get thrown in along with the beans. I think I'm going to take off a little bit more. Still feels like it's kind of loose here. Maybe another inch or so. That feels better. So, all this extra meat here, some of it's still got some bones and some cartilage in it. I'll trim that up as much as possible also, so I'm throwing mostly meat in with the beans. The only thing left to do with the ribs is to get rid of this membrane here on the back. That's not going to do any good. And then to trim off any excess sections of fat, like this part here. You do want some fat on your ribs, that's where you're going to get some of the juice from. But any places where there's a bigger pocket all kind of together in one place, that's not going to do anybody any good. So a little bit here, trim up, a little bit here. That might be about it for this rack. These aren't too fatty. Alright, As you can see, I've got the ribs trimmed up a little bit more from where I left them off. Got a little bit more cartilage off, trimmed off some of the excess areas of fat. Now we're going to do the seasoning. I would highly encourage you to experiment around with your own seasonings, figure out what you like. Mine's going to be a little different from anybody else's. Got a few seasonings arranged up here. I like my pork ribs to be pretty sweet, so I'm going to start with some brown sugar. I've never noticed a huge difference between the light and the dark brown sugar. I've read that some people do think there's a big difference for barbecuing. I've never been able to identify it myself if there is. So I'm going to start with a pretty heavy dose of that. I go sweeter than a lot of people do. More than I intended. Oh well. I go sweeter than a lot of people do for two reasons. One, I like my pork pretty sweet. And two, I don't use barbecue sauce at the end. A lot of people go with a more savory spice rub at the beginning and then add the sweetness at the end with sauce. I don't do that. So start off with the brown sugar. The next thing I'm going to add is paprika. I like a pretty heavy dose of paprika also. That's where I get a decent amount of the heat from, since I put in a lot more brown sugar than I meant to. I'm going to do a pretty heavy dose of this also to get a pretty good balance. I never measure the spices as I'm doing this. I just kind of eyeball it and see what works. I'm going to go with garlic powder next. Same idea. Enough to get some flavor. Looks good to me. Do some onion powder. I always try to use a little less onion than garlic. The garlic's a little more important flavor for me. Same idea with chili powder versus paprika. Chili powder has a bit more heat, but I like more of kind of a savory flavor, so I use some chili powder but more paprika. And I'm going to finish with some salt and pepper. If you can get a thicker grain salt and pepper, that's going to give you a little bit better texture. So I've got some coarse kosher salt here. That coarser grain is just going to give it a little bit more of a crunch on the outside, a little bit more texture. And you want to use a decent amount of salt and pepper both. There's a reason that those are kind of the two staple spices for everything everybody uses. Same idea here. I've got a table grind. It's a little bit coarser than what you're just going to get in a normal little pepper shaker. I'm going to give it a little more texture at the end. So I got all those. I'm just going to mix it in with my fingers. I just washed my hands a minute ago. Mix it in with my fingers and kind of see how it comes out. Break up the little brown sugar balls that kind of form in there naturally. And that's still looking a little bit too heavy on the brown sugar, so I'm going to balance it out with a bit more paprika, a bit more black pepper, give it a little bit of heat to balance out that sweetness. And since I eyeball all of my rubs that I'm doing, this is a pretty normal thing for me to do. Mix it once or twice, not be satisfied with the balances I come up with, and just kind of tinker with things until I get to where I'm satisfied. And I don't mind if I end up having a little bit of extra at the end. This is way more rub than I'm going to need for one rack of ribs. That's okay. I'm going to use some of it for the beans, and then whatever's left over at the end, I can save that for my next barbecue and not have to mix my own rub every single time. A lot of times I'll make one huge bag, keep it in a Ziploc gallon bag like I did with the brown sugar, and use that for several barbecues in a row. It's still probably a bit heavy on the brown sugar, but I think that'll work. So I'm going to start by just sprinkling a pretty generous coat over the top here. Try not to get any of the brown sugar balls or break them up as I'm doing it if I can. And there's always going to be some that gets left on the cutting board that's not the end of the world. I'll start by sprinkling it kind of all over. Try to get all of my surfaces covered. So I've got that pressed in pretty well. There's a few spots here that are still a little bit lighter coverage. I'm going to kind of try to fill those in, get a little bit more balance everywhere. And I didn't use a binder today. You can use mustard or apple juice or something like that and put it on the meat first so that everything sticks a little bit better. Sometimes I do that, sometimes I don't. Usually just kind of depends on what mood I'm in. It doesn't make a huge difference as far as I've observed. Just gets the rub to stick a little bit easier. That side looks pretty good to me. I'll flip things over, do the same thing again. And you'll notice that there's not really any flaps or just little pieces of meat sticking out here anymore. After I finish trimming all that up, it should come out to a pretty nice rectangular, even rack of ribs. That'll help it just cook more evenly, not have some parts that are getting super burned because they're getting more exposure, while some parts are still fighting to get up to the temperature you're aiming for. Just helps keep everything more even. And none of those flaps of meat are going to go to waste. All of those are going to go in with my beans and give those beans a lot more flavor. Get this rubbed all the way in. Now I'm just going to let this sit for a few minutes. I've already got the smoker coming up to temperature, got my charcoals lit. Usually that timing works out pretty well, that as soon as I get the charcoals lit, I start seasoning my pork. That gives the rub a little bit of time to kind of set its way on, for those flavors to work their way into the meat while the smoker's coming up to temperature. That way the smoker and the meat are both ready to meet at about the same time. Got the smoker up to temperature. Going to try to keep it around 275 today for the ribs. Go ahead and get these put on. I'm going to put them on the top rack today. I'm going to keep the beans underneath them while they're cooking. That way I've got the flavor from the ribs dropping down into the beans, and the fat that's dripping off is just going to be extra flavor for the beans. And also that steam, that moisture from the beans is going to keep the ribs nice and juicy. While I'm out here, I'm also going to open up my firebox, and I'm going to get my first few wood chips on. I'm going to go today with a mix of apple and hickory. It's a pretty good combination for anything pork. Alright, ribs have been cooking for a few hours now. I've got the beans on also. It's time to get the Chicago dogs going. For this, the meat itself isn't too tricky. It's going to be getting all the right toppings on it to do the Chicago style. So these are just some jumbo all beef hot dogs. I'm going to run them on the smoker as well, which is a bit unorthodox. I'm going to get a little bit of extra smoky flavor on there. Never done this with hot dogs, but I've done it with other types of sausage, and I really like that extra smoky flavor. So I'm just going to put these on. I'm going to put them down close to the fire so they're getting more heat, and check on everything else while I do that. The dogs cooked for about 45 minutes. I did about 25 on the first side, flipped them over to 20 on the second. So you can see they got a little bit blistered. It's just extra flavor. Now to do the Chicago style, it's all about the toppings. So we're going to walk it through the garden. I've got some onions, tomatoes, green pepper, and then I've got some spicy mustard and relish. The main thing is pile on as many toppings as you can without using ketchup. If you use ketchup, they will not appreciate and will not let it be called a Chicago dog. Gonna grab one there. Get some mustard. A couple of pieces of pepper. Just pile everything on. I like onion. And just a little bit of relish, go a long way. And that's our first contestant today. We got the Chicago style hot dog, and we're putting that up against the St. Louis style spare ribs. And for our second treat today, we've got some St. Louis style spare ribs. As you can see, I wrapped these in foil when I brought them in off the smoker. I let them get up to about 205 degrees internal temperature first. It took about 6 hours total on the smoker today. Texture is more important than temperature. They should start to be kind of peeling off the bone a little bit. You get along the edges, you should start to see some bone showing. It's more on this end. That means it's starting to pull away nicely. Fat's kind of rendering. Now, just going to carefully do this. Lift these up. And then just want to flip them over. It's a little bit easier to cut with the backside showing. Got a little charring here, but nothing too bad. Having them above the beans does help prevent that. And then just find a seam between the bones and cut right through. And get them tender enough, the bones will fall right out. You don't even have to cut them all. That's good. So, thank you for joining, and I hope you enjoy everything that I cooked today.